Sophia Lorenzo boards first class on her husband's airline, but her modest attire leaves her disdainful of passengers and prejudiced by the crew. A flight attendant publicly humiliates her, unaware that the woman she is trying to push into economy is the owner's wife. When the truth is revealed, the plane goes silent in shock, and Marcos Lorenzo changes the rules of the game, leaving no room for discrimination. But will Sophia be able to not only prove her worth, but also change the system itself? Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss news stories. Sophia Lorenzo sat in the waiting room of Sao Paulo International Airport, holding her first-class boarding pass. She is no stranger to flying. She often traveled with her husband, Marcos Lorenzo, the owner of one of the largest airlines, Airline Airlines. But this time she flew alone. Her ticket had been purchased in advance, but by the time Sophia boarded the plane, she was already being given sidelong glances. Her simple clothes, black jeans, a light blouse, no jewelry, minimal makeup made her stand out among the elite class passengers. She saw the flight attendants at check-in looking at her doubtfully, but they said nothing. When the boarding call was made, Sophia slowly walked towards the arm, following a group of passengers. She realized that many of them were first-class regulars, traveling in expensive suits and with designer suitcases. She didn't feel like a stranger, but she felt people staring at her. As soon as she entered the plane, she was met by the crew. "Welcome aboard Airline Airlines, miss," the young flight attendant began, but upon seeing the name on the ticket, her face changed slightly. "Lorenzo," Sophia said calmly, knowing that this moment would not be the last. "Come on in, to the first class, yes?" There was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Sophia didn't answer, but just headed to her seat. As soon as she sat down, she felt a new wave of stares. The woman across the aisle looked at her with mild disdain, and the man in the business suit glanced at her and turned away. "Do they really let just anyone in here now?" she heard a quiet voice behind her. Sophia pretended not to hear, but inside she felt an unpleasant feeling. She took out her phone and sent a message to Marcos. "Already on the plane. Everything is fine. Love you." The answer came almost immediately. "Have a great flight, meu amor." She smiled. But after a few minutes her smile disappeared. Another flight attendant approached her, a tall blonde in a perfectly fitted uniform with a patch that read, "Carla Rains, Senior Flight Attendant." She leaned closer and said in a quiet but sharp voice, "Ma'am, I'm afraid you seem to have mixed up the classes." Sophia looked up. "I'm sorry?" Carla looked down at her clothes, then back at the ticket. "Are you sure you're sitting in the right place?" Sophia exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. "Yes. Here is my boarding pass." She held out the ticket, and Carla took it and examined it quickly. For a second her lips pressed together. But then she smiled artificially, reservedly. "Are you sure you bought it yourself?" Sophia froze. She felt her insides tighten. "I'm sorry?" Carla leaned lower, her voice becoming a little quieter, but colder. "I just want to make sure that this ticket belongs to you. Perhaps it was purchased by someone else?" Sophia took a deep breath. She realized where this conversation was leading. Passengers were already watching them. Some were whispering, some were pretending to read a newspaper. But Sophia felt that everyone was waiting for her reaction. "The ticket was bought by my husband," she said calmly. Carla nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. "And your husband?" She deliberately fell silent, waiting for him to continue. Sophia understood what she wanted to hear. "But I didn't intend to play these games. I'm sure the database has all the information." "Check it." Carla pressed her lips together, but then smiled sharply. "Of course, ma'am. Wait here." And she went to the end of the salon. Sophia sat motionless, trying to maintain her composure. She knew that this situation was not an accident. She knew that she was judged by her clothes, by her appearance, and not by her real status. She had seen this before, but she didn't expect to encounter it on her husband's plane. But the worst was yet to come. Because Carla didn't come back alone. She was followed by another flight attendant, a middle-aged man with a serious expression on his face. "Ma'am, we have some questions about your ticket. Could you please come to the back of the plane for clarification?" Sophia stood up slowly. Her heart was beating fast, but she didn't allow herself to show even a drop of excitement. She took a step forward, looking straight into Carla's eyes. "I think it would be better if you clarify the situation here. Because, as far as I can see, your suspicions are not based on data, but on bias." Carla raised her eyebrows, but quickly pulled herself together. "Ma'am, please do not create conflict situations." Sophia smiled, but there was steel in her smile. "I don't create them. I'm waiting for explanations." At that moment a new voice was heard. "What's going on here?" Sophia recognized him instantly. And when she turned around, the whole plane froze. Marcos Lorenzo stood in front of them. And it was clear from his face that he had seen enough. Silence reigned in the first-class cabin. Sophia felt dozens of eyes directed at her, curious, contemptuous, expectant. Carla Raines, the senior flight attendant, stood before her, her expression impassive but her eyes filled with cold confidence. She didn't just doubt that Sophia belonged here, she had already made her verdict. "Ma'am, I'll repeat the question," she said loudly, so that everyone around her could hear. "Are you sure your ticket was purchased in your name?" Sophia took a deep breath. She didn't want to make a scene. But she wasn't going to let herself be treated like that. "I already answered. Check the information in the database, and you will see everything." Carla pressed her lips together, but then gave an irritated nod to the junior flight attendant. "Confirm the passenger's details." The man nodded and walked over to the monitor. But before he could say anything, a mocking voice was heard. "Of course. I'd bet someone gave her a ticket. People like her can't afford to fly here." Sophia turned around sharply. A woman in an expensive beige suit, with an exquisite hairstyle and expensive jewelry, looked at her with a slight smile. Her neighbor, a man in a business suit, chuckled and added, "Now, apparently you can end up in first grade just like that. If you know the right person." A light chuckle ran through the cabin. Sophia felt her insides tighten. She didn't know these people. They didn't know her. But they have already decided who she is. Carla returned to Sophia, crossing her arms over her chest. "Your ticket is indeed first class," she said, but her voice did not soften. "Then the matter is closed?" Sophia asked calmly. Carla paused, as if thinking about something. "But it's not just that." Sophia frowned. "What then?" Carla leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp but quiet so that only Sophia could hear. "You see, our first class is created for people of a certain level. We care about the comfort of our regular customers." Sophia felt anger boiling up inside her. "Are you implying that I don't fit this standard?" Carla smiled sweetly, but her eyes remained cold. "I just want to make sure you don't end up in the wrong place." Sophia gradually lost her patience. She understood that no one was listening to her here. The people in the salon had already drawn conclusions without knowing her history or her personality. But she wasn't about to let her head drop. "You know what's the strangest thing?" she said loudly, addressing not only Carla, but all the passengers around her. Several people looked at her warily. "You all decided that I was here by mistake. But if I had walked onto the plane in a designer suit and with diamonds around my neck, there would have been no questions." Carla blinked, her smile faltering. The woman in the beige suit tried to say something, but Sophia didn't give her a chance. "You don't check all passengers for their financial solvency. You just judge people by their appearance." The salon froze for a moment. But before anyone could answer, a low voice rang out. "What's going on here?" Sophia recognized that voice instantly. She turned around slowly. And I saw Marcos Lorenzo. His appearance changed everything. The passengers, who had just been laughing, now froze in tension. Carla turned pale, her confidence evaporating. "Sir," she began, but Marcos raised his hand, stopping her. His gaze settled on Sophia, and a mixture of worry and anger could be seen in his eyes. "Are you okay?" Sophia could hardly contain her emotions. She nodded, but there was steel in her voice. Everything is fine, but your employees don't think I have the right to be here. Marcos turned his gaze to Carla. Explain to me what happened. The flight attendant held her breath, clearly trying to come up with an excuse. Mr. Lorenzo, we are simply keeping order. We thought the passenger took her seat by mistake. Because she didn't look rich enough? Carla opened her mouth but didn't know what to say. Marcos took a step closer, his voice calm but menacing. Do you understand that you have cast doubt on my wife? The words echoed throughout the cabin. The woman in the beige suit let out a stifled gasp. The passengers who had just been laughing now looked at Sophia in shock. Carla froze, her face turning even paler. I didn't know. Marcos shook his head. This is not an excuse. Because this should not have happened to any passenger, regardless of their status. Sophia watched Carla's reaction, but now she didn't feel angry. She just realized how biased the world can be. But most importantly, she knew she wouldn't let this continue. And Marcos was in cahoots with her. You are suspended after landing, he told Carla. Sir, please. I will not tolerate discrimination in my company. Sophia took a deep breath, feeling the tension ease. But that was just the beginning. She knew that this incident would change not only her flight, but the entire system. The first-class cabin was enveloped in deathly silence. All eyes were on Marcos Lorenzo, the owner of Orion Airlines, who had just called Sophia his wife. Those who had laughed and cast contemptuous glances at her a minute ago now looked away, feeling the ground crumbling under their feet. And Carla Raines, the flight attendant who started this whole spectacle, stood in front of Marcos looking like she was about to be stripped of everything. Your wife? Her voice trembled. Yes. Marcos said this calmly but firmly, and his voice destroyed the last doubts. For the first time during this entire flight, Sophia saw fear in Carla's eyes. But that wasn't what worried her most. She looked at her husband. How would he act next? Marcos glanced around the cabin, checking the passengers' reactions. Many turned away, pretending they weren't there. But he had seen them before. He had seen how they mocked Sophia, how they considered her unworthy of being here. He took a step closer to Carla, not raising his voice, but making her shrink with every word. Your job is to ensure the comfort of passengers. All passengers. Not just those who look the way you think is right. Carla swallowed slowly. I was just following the standards. Marcos smiled, briefly and coldly. Standards? Are you saying that the company's standards say, humiliate passengers if they don't fit your idea of the elite? She blushed, but couldn't find what to say. Sophia watched this in silence, but inside she was torn apart by contradiction. She wanted justice to prevail, but the sight of Carla losing all her confidence was a mixed bag. After all, she, too, was a victim of a system in which status was more important than humanity. But that didn't justify her behavior. And when Marcos turned his gaze to her, she realized he wanted to hear her opinion. How are you, Mava Moore? He asked, his voice softening. Sophia took a deep breath. I'm fine. But I want to know one thing. Marcos looked at her carefully. Are you going to fire her? Carla's head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. She understood that now everything would be decided. Marcos nodded slowly. I will not tolerate such an attitude in my company. But the decision is yours. Sophia looked at Carla. She didn't beg or make excuses, but fear for the future was visible in her eyes. Until recently, she had been arrogant and self-confident, but now everything she relied on was crumbling right before her eyes. Sophia felt a strange feeling inside. She could ruin her career with one word. But will revenge change anything? Will this take away the injustice she experienced? She paused, then said firmly, I don't want her fired. But I want her to apologize not to me, but to every passenger she's ever judged by their appearance. Carla looked at her in shock. The whole salon was in shock. You don't want me to get fired? Sophia shook her head. I want you to understand what it's like to feel like a nobody just because others decided you weren't good enough. Carla closed her eyes for a second and then nodded slowly. She raised her head and looked straight at Sophia. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Sophia didn't answer right away, but then nodded. I know. Now prove that you understand. Marcos watched this, then turned to the rest of the passengers. This case is a reminder to all of us that status does not determine a person's value. He looked at each one, stopping at those who were laughing the loudest. Next time, think before you judge someone by their clothes. Sophia felt the situation change. Just an hour ago, she was the object of ridicule. Now it was she who taught the lesson. And this lesson will be remembered for a long time. The flight continued, but the atmosphere in first class was no longer the same. An hour ago, the passengers were laughing at Sophia, but now they looked away, as if trying to forget what had happened. Carla Rains, the same flight attendant who had caused the humiliating scene, now stood at the crew counter, avoiding looking in Sophia and Marcos's direction. But the problem wasn't just her. Marcos Lorenzo was not a man to leave questions unresolved. After the incident, he calmly returned to his seat, but his gaze remained hard. Sophia felt the tension in his posture. She knew he wouldn't leave things as they were. And when the senior flight attendant, a man of about 50 with graying temples, approached him, she realized that this conversation would be important. Sir, we sincerely apologize for what happened. We will discuss disciplinary measures after landing. Marcos nodded, but there was no forgiveness in his voice. Do you think the problem is only with Carl? The flight attendant hesitated. She went too far. No. Marcos shook his head slowly. The problem is deeper. This is not just one incident. This is a system in which a passenger is judged by his appearance. The senior flight attendant looked down. He couldn't argue with that. Meanwhile, Carla nervously tugged at the cuff of her sleeve, clearly feeling the weight of Marcos's gaze on her. When he turned to face her, she felt her world crumble. Do you realize that you could have lost your job? He asked quietly, but his voice was firm. Carla nodded slowly. I realize my mistake. Marcos didn't blink. A mistake? It's not a mistake. It's a conscious decision to judge a person not by their personality, but by their clothes. It's bias. And it has no right to exist in our company. Sophia watched Carla carefully, trying to understand whether she felt genuine remorse or was simply afraid of the consequences. Carla clasped her hands. I can't justify what I did. I used to think that first class was a privilege only for certain people. She paused. Now I understand how stupid it was. Sophia looked at her intently. And what are you going to do about it? Carla froze. She didn't expect this question. Marcos turned to face Sophia, his gaze softening slightly. Do you think she should be fired? Sophia took a deep breath. She knew that there was no room for someone like Carla in his company, but at the same time, she didn't want this lesson to be just a punishment. No, she answered. Carla looked up at her with surprised eyes. I want her to correct her mistake herself. Marcos frowned, but then nodded, respecting her decision. After landing, Carla, you will write a statement explaining what happened, he said. And then, if Sophia agrees, you will participate in the new customer service program. Carla did not immediately understand the meaning of what was said. What program? Sophia smiled, but there was determination in her gaze. We will change the approach to work at Orion Airlines. We will create a course that will teach the staff to respect each passenger, regardless of their appearance or status. Carla blinked, processing what she had heard. You want me to be a part of this? Sophia nodded. Yes. Because only the one who made a mistake can teach others how not to repeat it. Marcos looked at his wife intently, then smiled for the first time all day. He was proud of her. Sophia didn't just choose forgiveness, she turned the situation into a chance to change something bigger. Carla nodded gradually, realizing that she had a chance to fix everything. I will do it. As the plane began to descend, Sophia realized that this flight had changed her life. She not only proved her worth, but also became the one who will change the system. And now she knew that her role in this company was just beginning. The plane began to descend smoothly, and with every kilometer closer to the ground, Sophia felt relief. This flight changed a lot. When she came on board, she was considered an ordinary woman, not worthy of first class. Now she has shown everyone that human dignity is not determined by status or clothes. But most importantly, it changed the rules of the game. After landing, as passengers began to leave the plane, Marcos asked Sophia to stay for a few minutes. "You handled it better than anyone else," he said, looking at her with pride. "But this must not happen again." She nodded, understanding what he meant. "The system has to change," she said quietly. Marcos ran his hand through his hair, looking thoughtfully out the window. "Yes. And you will be the person who changes her." Sophia raised her eyebrows. "What do you mean?" Marcos turned to face her, his gaze serious but filled with warm confidence. "I want you to lead a new customer experience program at Orion Airlines." Sophia froze. She expected Marcos to take action, but she didn't think it would be on such a large scale. "Are you offering me to work in your company?" "No. I suggest you change it." Vivian, the company's senior manager, froze in the doorway. She was among those who underestimated Sophia, considering her simply the boss's wife. Now she saw her as a person who had come to change something. "Do you really want to hand over such responsibility to her?" she asked Marcos carefully. Marcos chuckled. "If you had seen how she handled that flight, you would have no questions left." Sophia felt a wave of pride, but then took a step forward. "I will accept your offer. But on one condition." Marcos raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" Sophia paused, then said firmly, "I don't want this to be just another change on paper. I want the new approach to be real, so that no one has to face the humiliation that I did." Marcos smiled. "Then you're accepted." The program was launched 2 weeks later. Now every employee has undergone a course in service ethics. Customers were no longer judged based on their appearance, and Carla Rains, the flight attendant who had once humiliated Sophia, now lectured on the importance of respecting every passenger. Ironic? Maybe. But it was the best way to prove that the lesson had been learned. Marcos watched Sophia from his office as she spoke to a new group of employees. He had never doubted her, but now he saw that he had made the right choice. She wasn't just defending herself. She changed the whole system. When the day was over, Sophia approached Marcos, smiling tiredly. "Well, are you happy now?" He pulled her towards him, gently touching her hand. "I'm proud of you." Sophia smiled. "And you know what? I'm proud of myself too." This flight began as a humiliation, but it ended as the beginning of a new chapter. Not only for Sophia, but also for all Orion Airlines.